Sure, Bill, we're ready.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call this virtual workshop meeting regarding the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District Assessment District Feasibility Study to order. For the record, my name is Bill Edgar. I'm the Chair, President of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. On behalf of the board, I'd like to thank everyone for logging in or phoning in today. We appreciate your taking the time out of your schedules to be with us this afternoon. This telephone conference constitutes the board's workshop meeting for the month of August 2020. For those who have read the agenda already, you will notice that the staff has put together a rather extensive list of instructions which are part of the printed agenda for the meeting. We have gone over this before, so I don't feel we need to do it again. Suffice to say, if you're having problems accessing this meeting, logging in, or finding a way to participate, please email Ryan Jones, our board clerk, or Leslie Gallagher, our executive officer, and they will try to help you. Now, regarding the meeting process itself, I think the way that we've run the meetings before has generally been good. Therefore, I'd like to proceed today as we previously have, and that is, as before, Ryan Jones will be moderating these proceedings from a technical point of view, and I believe he's going to operate the slides for the presenters today. He will, as well as Leslie and Michael Wright and the other staff, will field comments and questions addressed to the presenters either from texts or emails that they receive from you, or you can go through the chat function on the platform if you feel comfortable with that. Second, following each presentation, I'm going to ask the board for questions and comments from the board members. After the board is finished, we'll then unmute the public speakers, and Leslie and the staff try to identify as those who have requested to speak. I'll then call on those speakers on a first-come, first-served basis. After we've completed the public testimony, I will bring the matter back to the board for more comments, questions, or suggestions. We're not anticipating any final action on this item. You should be aware that this meeting is being recorded and will be housed on our website, just as our streaming videos for all our meetings are done so. We will be taking a break every hour or so as appropriate. The break will be for approximately 10 or 15 minutes to give our reporter as well as the staff a little time, a break, and to catch up. Ryan will place a sign that will appear on the screen during the break stating that the board is on a short break and estimating the time that they will return to the meeting. Finally, as I said before, I know we're all tired and crazy from being at home and stir crazy from being in the house, and we're all pretty much done with this virus. But since the virus isn't done with us, we have to preserve and keep going, doing our business as efficiently and effectively as we can. So I just urge everyone to just take a breath, relax, and try to be as calm and courteous and understanding of what we're trying to do during this difficult time. At this time, Leslie or Ryan, do you have anything you want to say at this point?
Could I just ask if Vice President Dolan can hear, or Ryan, can you check to make sure she's unmuted?
This is Jane. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, all.
Good afternoon, Jane.
Hi, Jane.
Okay, so we're prepared to go. Are there any other matters, Leslie, introductions or announcements you want to make that I didn't cover?
No, not at this time, Mr. President.
Okay. Members, we're on item 2, which is the roll call. Ryan, if you wouldn't mind, please call the roll to determine whether we have for the record, whether we have a quorum to conduct our business, please.
Board Member Grego.
Here.
Board Member Johnson.
Here.
Board Member Ramirez, Member Valines,
Here.
Board Member Countryman,
Ryan, I didn't hear them. I think they're there though.
yeah. President Dolan,
I'm on. I'm here.
President Edgar,
Board Member Ramirez is on as well. Could you call his name again? I can see him.
okay. Member Ramirez, it seems like he might have audio connection issues, but I can see him, so I'll mark him present.
Okay, and Mike Lines. Hey,
I'm
Mike.
I'm ahead of you, Bill. I already said it.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Mike.
I'm
Okay,
here.
we have a full board, sounds like. So we can proceed. Everyone's here. Members, we're on item 3, which is public comments not on the agenda. If anyone in the audience has comments regarding items not on the agenda, please send us a text to Ryan or Leslie, or raise your hand and try to get to anybody see anybody that wants to speak on an item not on the agenda?
Nothing here, Mr. President.
Okay. We're then on to item 4, which is the main item for today's workshop, the Sacramento San Joaquin Drainage District Assessment District Feasibility Study. Now, as the members will recall, in April of 2020, the consultant team, which was selected on December 20th, 2019, on April 20th, they provided informational briefings to representative interest groups to explain the approach of the feasibility study. Stakeholders were asked to identify which services, if any, that the consultant team should advance for further evaluation. Our May 5th, 2020 board workshop, the consultant team provided a similar presentation to what had been presented to the stakeholders and the public earlier. The consultant team then led the board on the 5th through a discussion of potential services to solicit input and feedback from board members and the public. The initial round of stakeholder meetings was completed by the end of June 2020, which was approximately 2 months ago. The consultant team then went back and, after our meeting on the 5th of May, reviewed the feedback of all the stakeholders and the board and identified specific categories of services with specific goals and objectives. Then a second round of meetings with the stakeholder groups was conducted in July and concluded in August, the last 2 months, to confirm the categories of services that would be advanced in the feasibility study. In a minute, I'm going to turn this meeting over to Ruth Darling, who's going to act as a ringmaster for the meeting. Ruth will provide the overview of the agenda and the purpose and objective of the workshop. Following Ruth's presentation, the consultant team will present the categories of services to the board and solicit further input and feedback from board members and the public. So that's a little background as to where we are. A lot of public involvement and engagement, and board involvement and engagement. And we're now at a kind of a second round for the board to look what has been provided based on our input on May 5th. So Ruth, if you could take it from there and present your report, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, President Edgar. Good afternoon, President Edgar, Vice President Dolan, members of the board. As Bill stated, my name is Ruth Darling. I'm a program manager for the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. I also serve as staff lead for the SSJDD Assessment District Feasibility Study. So the agenda, we're going to go over the first round of stakeholder engagement, discuss the 3 categories of service with stakeholder interest, and then 2 categories of services that would support implementation of small community flood risk reduction projects. So there's 5 in total that we'll go over. We'll pause for questions after each category is explained. And so the purpose of today's workshop is to solicit board input on the categories of services that will be further evaluated in the feasibility study, as well as to invite input and feedback from the public. Next slide. And so I would like to turn it over to Kim Floyd right now to discuss the stakeholder outreach.
Thank you, Ruth. Good morning, President Edgar and members of the board. President Edgar did a good job of summarizing our emphasis on stakeholder outreach throughout this process. And you may recall from our April presentation to the board that we have it. It's really stakeholder outreach and then all the technical work that falls between that. So this, as Bill stated, as President Edgar stated, our first round of stakeholder meetings was to try to find some consensus from stakeholders on services that could be advanced into the second phase of the study. So, you know, we did find that sometimes we were having discussions about, does this mean you're proposing these things for implementation? And no, we're not there yet. We are, again, trying to identify some areas that we can advance in the feasibility study that at least has some general support. And then, so we had that first round of meetings, and then we went back to our stakeholders after we refined some ideas for their input, shared those services, and we're bringing those to you today. This is just a summary of other presentations to the board. We've given a formal presentation to the coordinating committee, but we've also given some updates. We've been working in a formal situation with a subcommittee of the Central Valley Flood Control Association, and that's been hugely helpful. And then today, the board workshop. Next slide, please. So this is not a complete listing of all the stakeholder comments, but I think it fairly represents some of the major themes. Some pertain to this first stage of the study, and then others will have to be keeping in mind as we move the process forward. First, there was some concern, or there is some concern, that if an SSJDD assessment is proposed, property owners might not understand the roles of locals versus the state in providing services or collecting money for those services, and thus perceive there to be a duplication of services. So really, that's public information and messaging that would be critical if we were to implement. Also, LMAs expressed concern that an added layer of an SSJDD assessment might negatively affect their success in passing Prop 218s because they're still going to be in a position where they're having to raise money for ongoing OM3R. And that, one of the reasons they're concerned about that is because many are worried that landowners in particular, not taxpayers, but in general, but property owners, are tapped out in terms of assessments, especially in rural areas where there's increased financial pressure from other regulatory programs, most notably SGMA. That is a big elephant in the room. And then although we tried to stay focused on potential services to advance in the study, inevitably there were questions about how the assessment would be administered. So how would it be collected? How would the funding be returned to the communities? And that's something that we've asked stakeholders to work with us on as we move forward in the study process. We're not there yet. The Central Valley Flood Control Association asked specifically that we identify and clearly define which facilities provide regional benefits. Some are obvious because they're denoted as 8361 facilities, but others may not be. So this is something that we believe we'll address during the next phase as part of the work that we'll be doing, and Scott Brown will touch on that. One thing we were able to do in the second round of stakeholder meetings was clarify that an SSJDD assessment would require a property owner vote. I think there were some were under the impression, including me, when I originally started working on this project, that an SSJDD assessment could be imposed like a maintenance area assessment, and that is not the case. I think we're looking at hopefully something akin to a Prop 218 standard, where it would be, a weighted vote and a 50% plus one approval of the weighted, based on the weighted vote. We've also confirmed with stakeholders that we're looking at this as a subunit approach. It's hard to conceive, based on our conversation with stakeholders, that in most cases a district-wide assessment is feasible given the varying region-specific needs and issues. And lastly, we heard loudly and clearly that stakeholders want some consideration to be given to other potential revenue sources for future studies, so alleviating some of that pressure on property-based assessments. Specifically, the type of funding or revenues that could capture general benefits. So part of our scope is to identify other funding opportunities for potential future study, but it's not, studying those other potential funding sources are not a part of this study. We are very much focused, according to our scope, on the assessment aspect. So I'll pause and ask if anyone has any questions before turning it over to Scott Brown.
Do any of the members have any questions at this point? Okay, Kim, you're going to have to help me out here. I thought the state was not subject to a 218 vote. Is that what?
It's not. Yeah, it's not. But under the current SSJDD authority, it requires a 2/3 property owner approval. So we were, which is, as you can imagine, an extremely high bar. So, part of what we would look at during, if we get to the point where a service is feasible, we would develop an implementation plan, and part of that would be looking at that voting requirement. It's not feasible to conceive that we could remove that voting requirement, but perhaps we could get it aligned with a Prop 218 standard, which is what property owners are accustomed to.
Okay, and so you're saying that the 2/3 vote is a requirement of the existing statute?
As I understand it, yes.
Wow, okay.
But I think the bigger case here was it can't be imposed without a property owner vote. So that was, I think, again, there was an impression from others, including me initially, that this could be imposed like a maintenance area, and that is not the case.
Okay, I guess we were misled because the state is not impacted by a 218 requirement, but the existing statute requires a 2/3 vote, and what the input you're getting is that we would be better off adopting, or rather than the 2/3 vote, would be better off subjecting ourselves to the Prop 13, Prop 218 criteria. Is that right?
Well, I think that will have to be something we work out during the implementation phase. But
Okay.
you know how difficult it is to get a 50% plus one on a Prop 218, and it may become increasingly so
Right.
in the next few years. So a 2/3 vote seems, to be, again, a very high bar.
Right.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So we would be looking at something different, and I think, again, that has to be worked out when we get to the implementation phase, and we'll be back talking with stakeholders and the board. But our initial thought was, Prop 218, while not applicable to the state, is well understood by property owners.
Okay.
And so No, no,
in your outreach, Kim, I think that needs to be really emphasized that the existing standard is 2/3. That's what's in the law right now. And that's what we're faced with. We're considering the other 218, but don't give the impression that the state is subject to 218 provisions, because it isn't, as far as I know, legally.
right,
But
right.
this is a different nuance that I wasn't aware of. Okay.
Yeah, you and me both. I was taken aback at first too. So anyway,
Okay,
so noted.
Thanks. Anybody from the board have any questions? Okay, let's proceed with Scott.
All right. Good afternoon, President Egger, members of the board. Get technology to work here. My name is Scott Brown with Larson Rosell and Associates. Today, I'll be walking through 3 categories of services that we received positive feedback from stakeholders within the Sacramento Valley that they would consider moving forward in the study. I think most notably as well is that in our discussions with the San Joaquin Valley, we did not identify any potential services that we would want to consider within the SSJDD authority, because those local maintaining agencies within the San Joaquin Valley already have boundaries that are well drawn to encompass all beneficiaries from their services, and the use of the state authority to assess for services that would be provided within each individual LMA's boundary is already already capable within the existing authority of the LMA. So we have not identified any services yet from the San Joaquin Valley. We will continue to meet with them throughout the study and engage on our progress in the event that additional services come to light. After those 3 categories, Seth Rosell will present 2 categories from our involvement in the small community flood risk reduction studies. And those categories would assist locals in implementation of their projects and overcome hurdles that we've identified in raising local cost share. The first category of service encompasses activities and projects that would leverage beneficiaries beyond the current limitations of an LMA to assess for. So there's O&M activities, facility repairs, capital improvements for regional flood facilities that provide benefit to properties that are non-adjacent to the facilities themselves and lie outside the LMA boundaries. I think particularly we're aware that the urban areas that are seeking 200-year flood protection approvals notably benefit from these regional facilities. As I said, the LMAs cannot assess beyond their boundaries, and therefore the burden of operation and maintenance falls entirely on local properties. An example, through our meetings with stakeholders, our reclamation districts in the Yola bypass are required to maintain the bypass levees. Yet those support the 200-year flood protection that Sacramento and the West Sacramento regions are seeking by passing flows around the main stem down the bypass. So the potential of this first category would be to use the SSJDD assessment to provide a mechanism that the board could use to levy an assessment on properties beyond the LMA boundaries. Those would be properties that receive benefit from the regional facilities. And then upon collection, redirect those funds to the local maintaining agencies for operation and maintenance. Similarly, an assessment could also be levied to support or supplement local cost share for major capital improvement projects. One thing that we clearly heard from stakeholders was that the SSJDD assessment should not replace any obligations that the state currently has for maintaining 8361 facilities. So that's the first category, and I'd like to solicit any feedback or initial response to those. We will have a time at the end to go through all 5 categories for additional opportunity to provide feedback if you're still culminating on ideas. So, Mr. President, I'll turn it back over to you for feedback from the board.
Thank you, Scott. Any members have any questions or feedback at this point?
Hey, Bill, this is Tim. Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Can I know you said this, Scott, but can you just one more time explain why the San Joaquin side is different in this regard than the Sacramento side?
Yes. So I think the most notable difference, if you just look at at a map of the local maintaining agencies, there are multiple agencies in the Sacramento Valley with very defined boundaries, either based on facility features or hydraulic boundaries. But yet all of those features are interlinked and interact with each other. You look at the San Joaquin Valley, there are more or less 3 maintaining agencies. In the upper end, you have Madera County. Those facilities terminate at the Chowchilla bypass and drop into the bypass, and they are not impacted by operations of the bypass. There's no downstream interaction. Similarly, with the Merced Streams groups, those terminate into the bypass without any interaction. The lower San Joaquin Levee District is a very large district that encompasses properties that benefit from Madera County down to more or less to the Delta. And that boundary was specifically drawn to encompass all properties that benefit from those levee systems. It's not bifurcated by individual features or hydraulic regions. So that's the primary difference between the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys that are impacting the identification of services.
And is that an artifact of the way those boundaries were drawn, or is it more about the entities responsible, sort of as part of a checkerboard?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I think I'd rather defer to someone with more history in how those were developed, but I suspect that it does have to do with the development of reclamation districts within the Sacramento Valley that stepped forward to take on responsibility for operation and maintenance of facilities in a patchwork type approach.
Yeah, that'd be my guess as well. Thanks for that background. That's very helpful. Appreciate that.
Anybody else?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, as I understand what you're saying here is that if entity, let's say like the Safeco entity, sees a project outside of its boundary, that they could support operation and maintenance of that facility because of the benefit that they would receive. Is that what you're saying?
I think that Safeco is unique in that they are looking for those opportunities. Not all agencies
Right.
are. I think the inverse of that is what we're driving to, is that a district, say like Reclamation District 2035, can only assess for its properties within its boundary, and it can't reach beyond that to assess properties in the urban area for the benefit they receive by increased flows through the bypass.
But, well, what I'm trying to get to is this entity, which is a subset of the drainage boundary, would then have a vote to support it or not? Is that how this would work? In other words, it's not an assessment over the entire district. It's like a segment of the district.
That's correct. So the authority currently allows for a district-wide assessment or an assessment on a subunit basis. And on a subunit basis is the approach that we've been discussing with stakeholders that had buy-in, that if you identify a specific service that has a defined subset of beneficiaries or a subunit, the assessment would only apply to those properties.
And then how does that vote take place? Is that a parcel vote?
Currently, the water code, testing my memory here, Mr. Countryman, but I believe the water code currently states that it is a 2/3 of property owners by count or property owners by acreage is the current authority as it's written.
Okay. Wow, that's a pretty complicated thing to put on a... Anyway, okay, thanks.
Hey, Scott.
Yes, sir.
This is Bill. Is there if you would do a zone of benefit, for example, under the existing legislation, and you could do it by acreage or by property owner person, I guess is what you're saying. Does the individual parcel of property or the owner of that parcel, can you have different people doing it, or does it have to be one methodology for the whole area?
I believe that we will, well, first of all, we'll be defining this in our next phase of the project, what that methodology looks like. But I believe that currently we're looking at developing a single methodology for the entire subunit.
No, I'm talking about the existing statute.
Yes, I believe the statute requires
2/3.
a study. So the description of the backup to support the assessment is simply a study that's prepared by the state. It does not go into detail about requirements for the methodology.
Oh, okay. But whatever you decide, it's got to be 2/3.
It has to be approved by 2/3 of property owners, either by parcel count or by acreage.
And President, if I may, I just want to point out that, you know, as we move through this, we are tasked with developing an implementation plan, and that may include a pathway for a legislative process to make revisions to that 2/3 threshold. As I mentioned earlier, perhaps something akin to Prop 218, which is still requires a property owner vote, but is, you know, more aligned with what property owners are used to in current times. So
I understand that, Kim. I'm saying that,
okay.
Notwithstanding the changes we're recommending, what does the current statute require? And Scott said that it's 2/3 of the property owners or parcels, I guess, acreage. And the question was, does it have to be one methodology, or could it say be different within that zone of benefit? I don't know. anyway, apparently there's no direction on that anyway.
Right. I think if you look historically, there were, I believe, 6 assessments that were originally formed for the purpose of constructing facilities. And those 6 assessments had very specific regional limitations associated with those facilities.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
Anybody else at this point? Okay, let's proceed.
Okay, thank you, President Edgar. The second category of services that we found stakeholder support for had to do with services that would benefit from an economy of scale on a regional or programmatic basis. We discussed that there are certain activities that are common requirements for each LMA, but that are similar in their scope. And within the same region, these activities could be more cost effectively implemented on a larger scale. The economy of scale could be achieved on a local level without state involvement, but it would require additional governments, either through memorandums of understanding for contributions of funds or the formation of a new agency with its own assessment to secure the local funding. So the concept of the state under its existing authority to implement an assessment for these services would avoid any of those governance issues. An example that was discussed was regional permitting and environmental mitigation for vegetation management. So this would be, a single permit versus each LMA getting multiple permits, a single mitigation action that would provide coverage for each LMA carrying out those activities. So the potential for this assessment provides a pool of capital to leverage for a single larger activity that benefits all LMAs within the region or within the corridor. It could also place the Flood Protection Board in a position of being the lead state agency for CEQA and permitting, and there may be benefit to locals for that. And then we did identify that the benefits of funding through the SSJD assessment doesn't change the need for local oversight and governance of the use of funds and the activities that would be used for. So that's the second category briefing. I'll pass it back to President Edgar for feedback from the board.
Okay, any questions from the board members? Anybody, do you see any, Leslie?
Have any, Mr. President?
I see nothing from the public, President Edgar.
Okay, let's go to category 3 then.
All right, the third and final category that we discussed with stakeholders revolved around state maintenance areas. And the feedback we received was that state maintenance areas have difficulty implementing large repair or capital improvement projects because they are limited on how they can collect revenue under the water code. And currently, they are not allowed to collect revenue in excess of their annual expenditure plan, which is brought before this board for approval. There's limited ability to borrow from the general fund if expenditures go beyond that plan. and the code requires that those be repaid by subsequent assessment deposits. So without the ability to develop a reserve, large projects require a significant increase in annual assessment within the MA boundary during the implementation of the project over one to 3 year time frame. The potential use of an SSJDD assessment would, in this category, would be to develop an overlay assessment over each maintenance area that has large projects to carry out. The result would be that it would smooth the burden on landowners to pay for those projects. And with supplemental funds from the SSJDD, it could allow the MA's annual assessments to focus strictly on routine O&M and minor repairs that could easily be programmed on an annual basis. Stakeholders did identify that instead of an SSJDD assessment, why not just alter the water code to allow maintenance areas to collect reserves for future work? I think we'll identify that and carry that option forward. However, this has been, I think, an issue for a while, and there hasn't been any attempt that I'm aware of to alter the water code. So that's the completion of Category 3 summary. President Edgar?
Any questions from the board?
I don't see anything here, Mr. President.
Okay, thanks, Scott.
All right, we'll move on now to Category 4. Seth Wurzel will be presenting the next two categories associated with the small community study.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, President Edgar, members of the board. So for Category 4, what we identified under the Small Community Flood Risk Reduction Program and the feasibility studies is that many small communities don't have sufficient assessment base individually to provide a meaningful cost share toward improvements. Many would need assessments, far in excess of the average assessment passed by urban communities to obtain or to match a reasonable cost share for grants. And one approach we identified to resolve this would be to sort of widen the view or zoom out a bit on the small community and look at a more regional assessment approach. A broader assessment district could then fund an established capital improvement program over a longer time frame and basically amortize the cost of those projects over a greater period of time. That regional approach led by the locals would necessitate a formal governance structure to plan, fund, finance, and implement those projects over time. And those activities, that process of planning, funding, and financing and implementing improvements present a governance challenge to those communities that would need to be resolved. And not all of those problems could be resolved by the SSJDD, but we identified one way that the SSJDD could help resolve that. If you could advance the next slide, please. So specifically, the implementation of the assessments and by removing the implementation of the funding vehicle and the financing vehicle from the governance challenge, you sort of eliminate some issues associated with a formal regional governance structure. You open up more opportunities for alternative structures versus a JPA or a new special district that would need to be formed in order to impose and finance the improvements. There certainly are remaining governance challenges that could potentially be resolved through an alternative entity, but they still would remain. But the SSJDD's involvement would be voluntary and would be specifically to implement the assessment and to help finance the improvements. So further being voluntary, the local agencies that would desire this would need to approach the SSJDD and develop a program that they would want to finance. And essentially the SSJDD could be a mechanism to remove some of the burdens of administering an assessment and financing the program at the request of the locals. Ultimately, any funds that would be collected by the SSJDD would be utilized by the community according to their capital improvement program. So that's the approach for Category 4. This would be an alternative to help facilitate improvements in a rural basin where a governance entity challenges preclude the efficiency of financing improvements. So are there any questions on Category 4, President Edgar?
Let's see.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, Brian Johnson here. I'm just wondering if you have an example of a geography or the part of the system where that people have in mind when they talk about this category.
Well, there are several small community feasibility studies where we identified this as an option. One example was Colusa County, where we indicated that, you know, for the several small communities that the assessment capacity was just not was not there to be able to provide a meaningful cost share. And what we suggested was that, you know, if that community could, those several small communities could identify a series of improvements that could be implemented over time. In that scenario, you could finance the improvements over a longer time frame, perhaps a 40 or 50-year assessment. The notion of utilizing the SSJDD for this is something new that was not presented to the small communities. But it seemed the consultant team, I identified a potential opportunity where you could implement a zone of the SSJDD, for example, to take on a portion of that governance challenge. The implementation presumably would still need to be done at a local level, and the planning would need to be done at a local level.
And I think a key point here, if I might, this is Kim Floyd. Again, this would be voluntary. This would be the community approaching the board and requesting assistance.
Any other questions?
I see nothing from the public at this moment, President Edgar.
Okay. We're ready to proceed.
Yes, so moving on to Category 5, if you, the next slide, please. Another set of improvements that were identified in the small community flood risk reduction studies was non-structural flood risk mitigations. In many small communities, it wasn't very efficient to identify structural solutions and levee fixes and flood control structures to mitigate the risk to all improvements within the small community. And so the engineers identified alternatives that included floodproofing and structure raising. Those are often more cost-effective means to protect those properties in lieu of capital-intensive improvements. That presents a challenge with utilizing assessments and issuing debt to finance those improvements. More specifically, it would be hard to justify improving or charging someone a benefit assessment in order to finance their neighbor, for example's raising of their or elevating of their structure. So it's just not an appropriate funding mechanism. However, that you still leave a gap in the local cost share in order to finance those improvements. And there are federal the federal flood hazard mitigation program provides up to 75% cost share for home elevations. However, that still remains that remaining 25% that would need to be funded by the property owner. If you could advance the next slide, please. So the SSJDD could potentially be used, and this is just a concept, could be used to impose an assessment on a voluntary basis for willing property owners. The idea that I had here was that you could utilize something similar to the PACE model property assessed clean energy model, whereby property owners agree to assess themselves to finance the cost of home efficiency and water efficiency upgrades to their properties. If essentially what happens is the local sponsor of the program has a pool of capital. They offer that to homeowners to do these improvements. The homeowner agrees to put an assessment on their property, and essentially, once you have enough homeowners that have taken up and entered that program, the local agency would then issue debt secured by that initial pool of capital to roll the program continuously forward. We don't expect that there would be enough take-up of this in order to make an efficient program in any one individual community. So that's why the SSJDD presents an opportunity to look valley-wide at such a program. There are certainly challenges associated with this program. The biggest challenge to PACE programs for several years was the opposition by the Federal Housing Finance Agency that indicated that homeowners, by agreeing to assess themselves, were placing a lien or violating covenants of their mortgage and placing a lien ahead of the mortgage lender. And in response, the FHFA indicated that they would no longer issue federally backed mortgages or buy up federally backed mortgages in communities that had PACE programs. They've since relented on that, and this program has continued to move forward throughout the state. The one thing we couldn't do is rely on that same exemption here. We would have to investigate that. But this is a model that could potentially be utilized in order to finance those non-structural alternatives, and the SSJDD could present an opportunity to do that. So again, this is just a concept, and it would be completely voluntary for willing property owners that were looking to finance their home elevations. We've talked at an anecdotal level with counties that administer such a program, administer home elevation programs, and they're indicating that it is a challenge. They don't get as much take-up of the program because of the capital-intensive nature of the cost of the project and the local cost requirements of 25%. Not a lot of homeowners have $25,000 or $30,000 laying around, or are willing to be able or interested in doing a second mortgage or a home equity line of credit to administer such a program or to help finance those types of improvements. And so this could potentially present an option for the SSJDD. Again, there are a lot of challenges to this. It's an initial concept, but if the board's interested, we could explore this further through the study. So that is category 5 in a nutshell.
Okay, any questions?
This is Jane. I have a question.
Okay.
Have you identified a significant number of communities where this could be a benefit to warrant going ahead with the study?
Yeah, with respect to the small community studies, I think those alternatives were included in many of the preferred alternatives that where we had properties that were sort of stranded from the structural solution, the preferred structural solution. So there is a potential, and those were only in the small communities that we analyzed. There is, in urban communities, and particularly in Sacramento County, there are homes that could benefit from something like this. I think further investigation into that would be worthwhile.
Oh, I agree. Up in my area, the city of Tehama, very small, 6 square blocks. They did that in the 70s and 80s over time with various FEMA assistance and community development block grant.
Right.
The match. So if we can study that and look at some other methodology that could help these small communities meet that match, along with the assessment. Yeah, I agree. I think Grimes is looking at it now. I think they got some funding to investigate it. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the question is whether or not all property owners that are available to do that can finance the remaining local cost share. So this would be for the local component of that, the individual property owner.
Yes. Yeah, and that would be necessary because often these small communities do not have the socioeconomic base to provide private financing.
So that was the concept for Category 5. You know, through the implementation plan process, if the board was interested in pursuing this more, we could then scope out and identify what challenges would need to be overcome and what the approach would need to look like. At this point, we've just had some very preliminary conversations with folks that administer these types of programs on behalf of local agencies, other consultants, and counseled in order to understand whether or not this is something worthwhile.
Hey, Seth, looking forward to the implementation portion of your project, are you looking to come back with kind of an array of alternative suggestions for ways to fund these different projects in different geographical areas of the SSJD, or how is that going to work exactly?
Well, sorry, it sounded like.
I was going to say, I think Scott will be covering that kind of in our next steps in the following slides. Yeah, and I want to make clear that the 5 categories we just shared, we circled back with stakeholders. We're going to continue to do that through the end of the month. But to date, we believe that these have, and I don't want to confuse it with stakeholder support for implementation because that's a separate issue. These have stakeholder consent for moving forward to the next phase of the study, which is, are they feasible? And how would you define benefit? What methodology would you use? So with that, I think we should turn it over to Scott, maybe let him walk through the next steps and then come back to that question, Bill, if we have any answer to it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions from the board on Category 5? Okay, Scott.
Okay, so that concludes the 5 categories. At this point, we just wanted to provide one more opportunity for feedback on any of the categories. And while folks are thinking, I think to answer in response to your question, President Edgar, about the implementation plan, I think that our goal is to be fairly specific in the implementation plan with the categories that survive the feasibility testing. So these categories will move forward with, and I'll explain on the next slide, a little more of the process, or remind you of the process that we presented before. But at the conclusion of the study, if these are feasible solutions or options for the reutilization of the SSJD assessment authority, our goal is to provide a very specific, direct implementation plan of the actions that need to be taken to advance that authority forward, whether it's development of studies, legislative changes, further boundary modifications, whatever is required, and the actionable steps that need to be taken, that will be in the implementation plan. It won't be a vague array of alternatives. It'll be very specific.
Would those specific suggestions relate to geographical areas, though? In other words, for the Merced problem, you would recommend this, and for the other issue in Colusa would recommend this, and so on? Or are we going to get more general narratives that will have to utilize further studies more attuned to what local agencies go through?
I think that a lot of that will depend on what stakeholders provide us in terms of feedback of moving forward with specific actions that they want to see us identify. For instance, all of the YOLO bypass LMAs request that we specifically address implementation of an SSJDD assessment for YOLO bypass operation and maintenance in the implementation plan, we would do that. Certainly, we will have a process for any group of LMAs. You know, this is assuming that this category survives the feasibility testing that we'll be doing. But we would have a broad approach that could be used anywhere, and then if specific stakeholders request their area to be more detailed, we can do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from the board?
Chairman, I'd just like to make a comment.
Oh, sure.
Want to thank the staff for presenting this, and these are really interesting categories. I think there's a lot of benefit in the areas where we look at. And for me, as a board member and working on these projects, real benefit was for, you know, and you mentioned it in one of your first categories, was when you can look at environmental permitting and kind of be like the overarching lead for those kind of projects for the LMAs. Those are real benefits, and I'm sure that the smaller districts see the benefit of that as well. I mean, these state maintenance areas, I don't know if we have any of those in Yuba County. I'm not familiar with it, but I think it's really for those that do have that state maintenance area, there's a benefit for helping. I just I think when we can do like permitting stuff that helps streamline for the agencies, that's always a great benefit and service. My 2 cents.
No, great. Thank you. Any other comments?
Yeah, Mr. President, this is Jane.
Mm-hmm.
Well stated, board member, and I agree. When the state can assist rather than require, I think that that's a great benefit. I think these categories are very interested and need to go forward. What I would encourage some thought to this is what needs to be put in the recommendations that will allow momentum to be sustained. These kinds of things, well, they've been studied before, lots of studies. Here's these 10 things that would all help. And then they just kind of go somewhere. They don't go to action. They just go to someone's library, I guess. So I think some kind of methodology of who or what or how can start the momentum and keep it going over the years to assure implementation. These are all categories that have popped up from various times in the last decades. So I think this is great and timely and going to be very challenging to do, but necessary. So thank you for all of this work and ideas, and thanks for the regular updates so we don't get the whole report in a big chunk at once. I appreciate that.
Jane, would you, in terms of sustaining interest and over time, the only thing we've been able to do in our years on the board in order to do that is to maintain the funding for these regional planning areas, which, you know, come together and have meetings and push their local projects and the regional projects. And in some cases, like the Yolo Basin, have decided to consolidate some of the RDs. The only way we've been able to do that are, and I don't know whether this is what you're talking about, but it seems to me a permanent funding of those regional planning areas would be a way to sustain the effort and over time to make sure that we don't lose interest in making these improvements and attending to the maintenance of what we're supposed to be doing.
Mr. President, yes, I agree with you, and thank you for helping me to to make that more specific. I think that regional planning and the funding for it has been a great benefit all the way around with resolving issues, not just bringing them forward, but resolving. So if we could find a way to institutionalize it so that there's not gaps in its funding and its activity, I think that would be a very good thing to do.
This is Kim Floyd, if I may, President Edgar.
Yes.
I just want to, we did talk about some of that with stakeholders, and what we tried to propose based on their input were areas that are not currently funded by the state. The one thing they were clear about is they didn't want us to propose anything that would supplant existing funding. This was designed to be new funding. So we will take the RFMP advice into consideration, but that was one of the reasons we did not push it forward to this stage, was because it's something that, we're trying to identify gaps and provide new funding. If that makes sense.
Well, yeah, but the problem is that every year we go after the funding on the regional planning areas, and it's a real battle, as you know. And it seems to me that there's, maybe not with this funding source, but we need to institutionalize that funding, or we'll lose all the people that attend those meetings, which are, which have been instrumental in getting this plan done.
Agreed. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments from the board?
President Egger, just a comment. We were just talking about funding, and this environmental climate that we're in right now is not conducive to what we're proposing, but I know it's years, probably a couple of years down the road before this actually gets going. I think the most important thing is building the trust between the board and the stakeholders as it relates to this future assessment. And so I'm anxious to see how that all works out and to hear more about how that's occurring, because I can tell you from my perspective here in Yuba County and Sutter County, nobody's anxious to vote for more taxes.
Okay, anything else?
No, this is Jane. You're not alone. And yes, you're right. We got to build trust, communication, and transparency.
Yeah. That's right.
President Edgar, I believe Mr. Reinhardt.
Okay, Rick.
President Edgar, members of the board, Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers on behalf of the California Central Valley Flood Control Association. I want to start off by complimenting the board, your staff, and your consultant team for how you've conducted the study. We really appreciate the engagement and the consideration of the thoughts that our subcommittee had on how to make this study successful. I do want to emphasize the last point that Member Griego and Dolan touched on, and that's it doesn't. The feedback that I've heard is there's not an appetite for property taxes out there, and the beneficiaries of the flood control project are more than the property owners. I think the study team has done a good job of narrowing it down to some specific areas where we can explore whether there might be that property owner support. But right now, I think it's a tall order to build a consensus among the property owners to raise their taxes. One of the things I'm hoping is that while the study may not get into detail on it, that it does identify other funding mechanisms like a sales tax that would benefit, generate revenue, and also capture more of the beneficiaries than just the property owners. And lastly, one of our members had suggested that one way to incentivize this is to set it up so that the assessment occurs with some form of, I'll say, matching state appropriation. I don't mean dollar for dollar, that needs to be worked out, but maybe it can be an incentive that if the property owners assess themselves the state will match it with this amount out of whatever, general fund or bond or something along those lines. Because very clearly we need to raise revenue. We have a number of demands that your team has articulated. I just don't want to put our eggs in the basket relying on property owners to approve this and then not have anything if they don't support it. And so those were just two thoughts on if there doesn't end up being an appetite among the property owners, how we identify ways to either make it successful with matching state funds or looking at other revenue streams. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Rick. Anybody else, Ryan, you see in the public?
Nobody else, President Edgar.
Okay. Ruth, does that conclude the staff report at this point?
Does.
Okay. I'll bring it back to the board.
Kim, did you have something?
There were just a few more slides about next steps we'd like to cover just to make the board aware where we are going from here.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, I was getting a call there. So just an update quickly on the project schedules. It stands. As you know, we got a little bit of a slow start as we all sheltered in place, but we're wrapping up the first phase of the project at the end of this month. We'll be developing our current context analysis around these services that we've presented to you today. And then in an attempt to move the, or to pick up the schedule slack, we're going to attempt to overlap the next two phases a little by defining beneficiaries and evaluating methodologies and test cases at the same time, with the hope to then be able to develop the final report and bring it home to you all in May as previously planned. So our next steps moving forward, as we stated, we're wrapping up round two of stakeholder engagements. We did hear from stakeholders a number of questions about why are you doing this? How is it going to work? How would the assessment work? And I think we need to develop some of these introductory sections of the report and get those out to stakeholders to start soliciting feedback on. So we'll start working on that. And again, our current context analysis now will focus, be able to focus around these facilities and also address the request from the Flood Protection Association for a clear definition of what system facilities are. That will all go into that. And then with Kim's leadership, we'll be planning for our third round of stakeholder engagement as we come out of this group of work. So I think with that, that's our presentation for today. We just wanted to remind everyone to contact us if you have any questions, either through Ruth, probably is the best way to approach that. And we appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Scott. On behalf of the board, and I know they've done it separately also, thank the staff for good presentation and looks like good outreach on in a very difficult environment that we're talking about additional revenue sources for flood control. So in any event, good job, and the board's going to look forward to your next presentation along the implementation lines. We'll see what the stakeholders say about that. That'll be interesting. Any concluding comments from the board members at this point? Okay. Yes.
Bill, it's Mike Valines. I just wanted to thank everyone for this, but also everything we did this morning. It took a lot of staff and organization, and it was hot and everyone did a great job. It worked out really well. And I just want to say thanks.
Yeah, great, Mike. Thank you for saying that. Okay, anything else on that subject? Okay. Without any objection, we'll move on to item 5, which is public comment at this point again. We see any people want to speak on any other items, Ryan?
I see none, President Edgar.
Okay. Okay, then we're on adjournment, and without objection, this workshop on the update of the San Joaquin Valley and the impacts of the study is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. See everybody.
Good.
Thank you, Ryan.